In the underworld, revenge is usually loud. It comes with gunfire, bodies, and chaos that spills into the streets. But some reckonings are designed to be remembered, not rushed. They unfold slowly, in public, where every witness understands exactly what they're seeing and why it matters. In 1963 Harlem, one such reckoning took place at an ordinary restaurant table, and by the end of the night, the balance of power had quietly returned to where it belonged. For 11 years, Harlem had learned to live without its king. The streets still moved, money still changed hands, and new faces rose to positions they believed were permanent. Time created a dangerous illusion that absence meant erasure, that prison had ended an era rather than paused it. But power, when it's real, doesn't disappear. It waits. When Bumpy Johnson came back to Harlem after more than a decade away, he didn't announce his return with threats or violence. He didn't reclaim territory overnight or call meetings to reassert control. Instead, he did something far more unsettling. He let the people who had replaced him continue exactly as they were long enough for everyone to see the contrast between borrowed authority and earned power. One man, in particular, believed he had escaped consequence. He had built a comfortable life on foundations that weren't his, convincing himself that time had buried the past. He believed the city had moved on. He believed the debt was forgotten. And like many men who mistake silence for forgiveness, he chose the worst possible place to feel safe. This story is not about a sudden act of violence. It's about a return, about patience, about why some punishments are meant to be carried, not delivered in a single moment. Because what happened at that table wasn't just personal justice, it was a message to all of Harlem. A reminder that power doesn't vanish when you take it, and that betrayal never expires. For more than a decade, Harlem functioned under a dangerous illusion. On the surface, everything appeared stable. Clubs were open, money flowed, new bosses settled into familiar seats, convinced they had inherited a permanent order. But beneath that surface, something fundamental was missing. The authority holding Harlem together was no longer rooted in loyalty or earned respect. It was borrowed, fragmented, and quietly contested. When Bumpy Johnson was taken away in the early 1950s, his absence created a vacuum no one could truly fill. The systems he built continued to operate, but the values behind them began to erode. Protection turned into exploitation. Stewardship turned into ownership. Men who had once answered to Harlem started answering to outside interests, justifying their choices as survival or adaptation. This is how power decays when it's not anchored. New figures rose by positioning themselves as intermediaries. They claimed to keep things running smoothly, but smoothness came at a price. Payments went north instead of staying local. Decisions were made with permission rather than conviction. Harlem wasn't conquered, it was leased out piece by piece. And because it happened slowly, many people accepted it as the new normal. Time worked in the favor of those who benefited. Each year without Bumpy reinforced the belief that he was finished. Prison, they assumed, erased relevance. Absence, they believed, meant surrender. The longer the city moved without him, the easier it became to rewrite history to suggest that the structures in place now were self-made, not inherited. But Harlem remembered more than its new rulers realized. Older faces noticed the difference immediately. Conflicts lasted longer. Promises carried less weight. Respect became transactional instead of instinctive. What had once been enforced quietly now required constant negotiation. The city still functioned, but it no longer felt protected. It felt managed. That distinction mattered, because true power isn't measured by how long you can hold a position. It's measured by what happens when you're gone. And in Harlem, the years without its king didn't erase his legacy. They exposed how fragile everything else was without it. By the time rumors of his return began to circulate, the city wasn't just waiting, it was overdue. Betrayal rarely arrives wearing the face of an enemy. More often, It grows out of familiarity, ambition, and opportunity. In Harlem's case, it came from someone who once stood close enough to learn everything, not just the mechanics of power, but its habits. When Bumpy Johnson was taken away, he didn't leave his empire unattended. He left it in the hands of someone he believed understood the difference between stewardship and ownership. At first, the arrangement looked responsible. Operations continued, money moved, the streets stayed relatively calm. The man left in charge spoke the language of loyalty and framed his actions as temporary caretaking. But time has a way of blurring intentions. What begins as holding things together slowly becomes making decisions, and eventually, decisions turn into entitlement. That shift didn't happen overnight. It unfolded in stages, each one easier to justify than the last. New alliances were formed under the excuse of protection. Payments were rerouted for the sake of stability. Boundaries that once seemed unbreakable were quietly redrawn. Each compromise was explained as necessary. Each concession was labeled practical. And because the original authority was absent, no one was there to say no. This is how betrayal rationalizes itself. The most dangerous part wasn't the deals made behind closed doors. It was the confidence that followed them. The belief that success proved legitimacy. That survival validated choices. That time itself had rewritten the rules. Harlem didn't resist loudly because the transition wasn't violent, it was gradual. And gradual change feels less like theft and more like evolution. But borrowed power always carries a flaw. It depends on forgetting where it came from. The man who rose during Bumpy's absence didn't build a foundation. He inherited one and mistook access for authorship. He believed the crown had changed hands simply because it had gone unchallenged for long enough. What he failed to understand was simple and fatal. Absence is not abdication. Some leaders don't disappear when removed. They wait, they observe, and when they return, they don't argue over narratives. They collect what was taken. By the time Harlem sensed the old order stirring again, the damage was already done. The protégé had crossed the line from caretaker to usurper and convinced himself there would be no reckoning. History was about to correct him. Prison is meant to erase men. It strips routine, authority, and relevance, replacing them with time endless, punishing time. But for Bumpy Johnson, those 11 years didn't dissolve power. They refined it. Silence became distance, and distance became clarity. Away from the noise of the streets, Bumpy did what he had always done best. He studied people. From behind walls and locked doors, Harlem never truly left him. Information still found its way in, carried by visitors, rumors, and the quiet reports of those who hadn't forgotten where their loyalty began. Names surfaced, patterns repeated. Who was thriving? Who had switched sides? Who had grown comfortable in spaces that once required permission? Prison didn't blind Bumpy to these changes, it sharpened his memory of them. Time works differently for men who understand consequence. While others assumed years would dull resentment or erase obligation, Bumpy treated time as accumulation. Every month added context. Every silence confirmed intent. He didn't need daily updates to understand the larger picture. He knew exactly what prolonged quiet meant. People thought he wasn't coming back. That belief was the real mistake. For the men who had benefited from his absence, time created confidence. They built routines around the idea that the past was settled. Deals hardened into habits. Luxury replaced caution, and with each year that passed, the fear of consequence faded. That comfort wasn't accidental, it was the byproduct of believing that power only exists in the present tense. Bumpy understood something they didn't. Power has memory. 11 years gave him more than patience. They gave him perspective. He no longer needed to prove dominance through constant enforcement. The city itself would do that work for him when the moment came. Harlem had watched who paid and who took, who protected and who exploited. By the time Bumpy prepared to return, the contrast was already visible to anyone paying attention. Silence, in this case, wasn't weakness. It was preparation. When Bumpy finally stepped back into Harlem, he wasn't returning to reclaim what was his. He was returning to collect what had been held and to address what had been stolen under the assumption that time had erased the debt. It hadn't. Not even close. When Bumpy Johnson returned to Harlem, there was no warning shot, no public declaration, no attempt to reassert himself through force or spectacle. That was deliberate. Loud returns invite resistance. Quiet ones expose truth. Bumpy didn't want to shock Harlem. He wanted to observe it. He came back looking older, weathered by time, carrying little more than memory and certainty. To those who had only heard stories, he seemed like a figure from another era, a name spoken in half-whispers by men who used to matter. To those who had lived through his reign, his presence was immediately unsettling, because real power doesn't need updating. It's recognized the moment it reappears. Bumpy didn't rush to reclaim territory or summon former allies. He didn't confront anyone directly. Instead, he went where information moved fastest: familiar streets, trusted apartments, quiet rooms where loyalty hadn't expired. He listened more than he spoke, and what he heard confirmed everything 11 years of silence had already taught him. Harlem had been divided neatly, efficiently, and profitably, not by chaos, but by comfort. The men who took over had grown used to control without accountability. They wore it casually, mistaking routine for legitimacy. But beneath that confidence was something fragile, the fear of being seen by someone who remembered how things were supposed to work. That fear surfaced the moment Bumpy's name re-entered conversations. Some rushed to offer explanations. Others pretended nothing had changed. A few tried to position themselves as indispensable intermediaries, hoping proximity might shield them from consequence. None of it mattered. Bumpy wasn't interested in excuses or narratives. He already knew who had stayed loyal, who had benefited, and who had crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed. Most importantly, he understood that confronting betrayal too early would only give it room to argue back. So he waited. He let the men who had grown powerful continue their routines. Let them sit in their favorite seats. Let them believe the city had accepted them permanently. Because power taken in silence is best reclaimed the same way, without warning, without negotiation, and without the need to chase. The reckoning, Bumpy decided, would not come in an alley or a back room. It would come in public, at a place where everyone gathered, where the city watched itself, where the man who believed he had escaped the past felt safest of all. Only then would the return be complete, and only then would Harlem remember exactly who had never left. Some confrontations are meant to be hidden. This one was designed to be seen. Bumpy Johnson understood that if betrayal had flourished in silence, accountability had to arrive in public. That's why the meeting didn't happen behind closed doors or through intermediaries. It happened where routines were strongest, where confidence had grown careless, and where witnesses were unavoidable. Table 7 wasn't just a seat, it was a symbol. For years, it had functioned as a throne, a place where authority was performed weekly, reinforced by habit and audience. By choosing that exact setting, Bumpy turned familiarity into evidence. Nothing about the moment felt rushed. Timing mattered. So did visibility. When power is reclaimed quietly, it can be denied. When it's reclaimed in plain sight, it becomes fact. The room itself did half the work. Regulars recognized the faces. Staff understood the tension. Conversations thinned, then stopped. Not because of panic, but because instinct took over. People sensed that something final was unfolding, not an argument, not a negotiation, but a correction. This wasn't about settling scores. It was about restoring order. What made the scene decisive wasn't force. It was control. Bumpy didn't need to raise his voice or issue threats. He let the setting speak. Every chair, every glance, every pause reinforced the same truth. The authority that had been borrowed was now being audited, publicly, irrevocably. In that moment, the illusion of escape collapsed. Time could no longer be used as a shield. Success could no longer be used as justification. The city itself became the jury, and it needed no explanation. Harlem knew who had built the system and who had benefited from its absence. The difference between the two was suddenly impossible to ignore. This is why the encounter mattered far beyond the individuals involved. It reset the rules without rewriting them. No new laws were announced. No ultimatums were delivered. The message was simpler and more effective. Power that isn't earned can be revoked the same way it was taken calmly, deliberately, and in front of everyone. By choosing Table 7, Bumpy transformed a personal reckoning into a public standard. He showed Harlem that accountability still existed, that memory still counted, and that time didn't dissolve obligation. It only postponed it. When the moment ended, there was no confusion about the outcome. The city had watched authority return to its rightful place, not through spectacle, but through certainty. When the night finally settled and the restaurant returned to its familiar rhythm, Harlem understood something it hadn't fully grasped in 11 years. Power hadn't changed hands, it had only been misplaced, and now it had been quietly reclaimed. Bumpy Johnson didn't return to Harlem to relive the past or chase revenge. He returned to restore memory. The lesson wasn't delivered through chaos or fear, but through recognition. Everyone who mattered saw it clearly. Authority built on borrowed foundations cannot survive the return of its source. The man who believed time had erased his choices learned the hardest truth of all, that silence is not forgiveness, it is patience, and patience, when paired with certainty, is far more powerful than rage. Harlem didn't need speeches to understand what had happened. It felt the correction immediately. Lines reappeared. Debts were recalculated. Confidence shifted. What followed wasn't war. It was order. Men who had grown bold during the absence stepped back without argument. Outside interests reconsidered their reach. Not because they were threatened, but because they understood the cost of testing something that had proven it could wait indefinitely. This is why the moment mattered. It wasn't about punishment. It was about permanence. Bumpy showed that real power doesn't need constant enforcement. It needs memory, legitimacy, and the willingness to act only when the time is right. He didn't hunt his betrayer. He let him sit comfortably until the city itself bore witness. In the end, Harlem didn't cheer. It didn't panic. It adjusted, because it recognized something familiar returning to its place. You can take a man off his streets for 11 years. You can wear his name thin with time. But if his power was real, it doesn't disappear. It waits. And when it comes back, it doesn't ask for permission.